Hello, my name is Sarah Tyson, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Colorado Denver. I'm talking with Dr. Andy Yost, lecturer in the Department of Philosophy, about how he is thinking about the pandemic using the tools and methods of philosophy. Good morning, Andy. Thanks so much for being here.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm excellent. I'm excellent. Staying entertained in my house during quarantine, but other than that, I'm doing great.
Great, great. Well, will you tell us a little bit about how you got into philosophy?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think for anyone that has an interest in philosophy, that can be a long and winding answer. So I'll try to not let it be that, but I'll give you kind of a sense of it. I grew up in Southern Ohio in I would say, a pretty conservative kind of Calvinist evangelical home. I mean, we weren't crazy or anything like that. Like, there were no snakes involved or any speaking in tongues, but we had a pretty, I would say, rigid theology. And if you know anything about Calvinism, you don't really need to know anything about Calvinism to appreciate the point I'm about to make. One of the key Calvinist ideas is this idea of predestination. So everybody that's born is born into one of two paths. You're either going to hell or you're going to heaven. Well, that comes with some obvious logical problems when you put it up against the question of God's goodness and so on. We all know the problem of evil. So at the age, of most people, for me, around 16, that became a problem. And I raised the issue to my parents, and like the loving parents that they were, we went back and forth about the issue, and I found their answers and then the subsequent answers of my Sunday school teachers and pastors unfulfilling. But at the same time, I had some relationships with a couple of friends who were actually my brother's friends, a little older than me, who put me on to other philosophers that, and I'm happy, actually, this is an important point in my story. I'm happy that they put me on to philosophers that were not antagonistic to religion, but that
Mm,
offered an alternative way of thinking about religion. So, for example, Soren Kierkegaard and his theistic existentialism. So I was able to not completely jettison what I'm sure anyone that grew up in a religious environment can appreciate, which is sort of a deep sense of location in the tradition itself, but at the same time be able to live on the margins of the tradition and see alternative ways of thinking about God. So for me, this, sort of typical clash with religion in early or late adolescence, my early teenage years, coupled with the helpful guiding hand of just some older guys that were already into philosophy, really opened the floodgates for me. And, why did it really energize me to be thinking about philosophy or thinking philosophically? That might be an impossible question to answer. If I were born two doors down, maybe I'd be more interested in, professional wrestling than philosophy. But for whatever it was, for whatever reason, it spoke deeply to me, and it's been a fun ride ever since.
yeah, and so now you are interested in Romanticism and actually Romanticism in a time of secularism. So the story you've told about religion and philosophy of religion and philosophers who treat religion seriously, um, this is starting to shape up with a little bit, the picture is starting to take some shape. So will you just talk about what Romanticism is and why it's compelling to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to come to the question of what romanticism is through a slightly different angle than I think your question is framed, but I want to honor your question and answer it directly. So let me take the question of what romanticism is and just hold it in abeyance for 1 minute and
Mm,
connect up this sort of story that I've told of my teenage years and my current intellectual interests as a philosopher in romanticism. So, um, as I studied philosophy as an undergraduate, graduate student, and in my doctoral studies, I remained concerned with what are sort of central Christian ideas. Fundamentally for me, the question of love has been a pressing question for my intellect or intellectually throughout my whole life. What is love? I was never satisfied with sort of the traditional sort of scientific secular account of love as some complex chemical reactions in my brain, a flush of dopamine, whatever. I always sensed that there was something more than that, so I took a circuitous route through the study of religion into phenomenology, and I started to think more about the relationship between um, things as they appear, which is phenomenology is the study of appearances, things that appear to us, and I started to look at love through a phenomenological lens. So I did a lot of work and a lot of study around that idea, the phenomenology of love. And in my studies there, I started to pick up on this. I started to sense that there was a relationship between love and the imagination. So then I started to study the imagination pretty closely, and that connected me up with the Romantics, who had a very robust and well developed and diverse view of what the imagination is. So for me, the connection between sort of, if I could use a shorthand, a fall from faith, but a continued interest in it through an inquiry into love and the imagination, I was led to Romanticism. So now back to your question then. So, what is Romanticism? I mean, it's notoriously hard to define. I think, in fact, a lot of scholars have I think given a noble attempt at defining it, but like most definitions, the definition fails. But I can tell you that it's at least a cluster of ideas, and I'll tell you what some of those ideas are. Generally speaking, we think of Romanticism, at least at first glance, as a literary or maybe aesthetic movement, but it's the ideas out of which the aesthetic theories emerge that to me as a philosopher are interesting. So here's a few of the ideas that make up what we think about as Romanticism. The first is, as I've already mentioned, a serious concern for the role of the imagination in constituting the way we experience the world. So Romanticism, roughly speaking, runs from 1750 to 1850. Obviously, there's some arbitrariness to those dates, but generally that's the era we think of, which is right on the heels of Kant, right? So Kant's Critique of Pure Reason gives us transcendental idealism and this idea that the human mind plays a constitutive role in the world as we experience it. And so the Romantics really picked up on that, especially the German Romantics, but not only the German Romantics. And they started to say, well, look, if Kant's right about this idea that the imagination plays a constitutive role in the way we experience the world, then that says a lot about the power of the imagination. So, to use their language and Kant's language as well, the Romantics moved away from a mimetic or mirroring or replicating theory of the imagination, like Plato, for example, gives us, right? The images in our minds are um, poor children of poor parents, right? They're a reflection of the reflection that we have. So they're deceitful even for Plato, or can be deceiving for Plato. But for the Romantics, the imagination itself was a way to imbue experience with things like beauty, love, truth, meaning, because fundamentally, philosophically, the imagination plays a constitutive role in the way we experience things. So Novalis has this great idea that now sounds like a cliche, but at the time wasn't, this idea of romanticizing the world. And what he means by that is, this is his language, to raise the finite to the infinite, or give the finite the dignity of the infinite, he says. So that's one core idea in sort of romantic thought. Another core idea in romantic thought is a deep concern with sincerity. So, sincere expression is seen as a way in which truth unfolds into the world. You can contrast that with a lot of our, and I don't want to be that guy who's super critical of, say, social media, for example, but you can contrast, say, sincere conversation or sincere expression with what we might call snark, which the internet is full of, right? In a lot
Mm-hmm.
of, especially in social media, memes, that sort of thing, the nature of the communication is, what can I say that's clever? What can I say that's pithy? Maybe makes you laugh or smile for a second before you scroll on. But for the Romantics, there was a deep concern, or an abiding concern with sincere expression, because for them, and this is the philosophical undertone, because for them, the self itself is a process of active unfolding. And so any creation, any saying, any expression is itself an expression of the truth of nature unfolding. A third, I'll give you five ideas.
Mm.
So I've given you two so far. I'll speed up the other three. The third is a, a concern with nature. So the Romantics cared a lot about nature with a capital N, not nature with a small n. So nature with a small n for us might be something like the ecosystem, the world outside, even the globe, the earth itself. But for us, nature is like plants and animals and minerals. Intuitively we know that it's made up of matter, and it can be neat, but fundamentally it's a biological network. Um, Not only biological, but you know what I mean. It's a material network, let's say. But for
Mm.
the Romantics, nature with a capital N, and you will start to hear echoes now of sincerity and imagination as well. Nature with a capital N um, is sort of the great mystery of existence. It is the um, I'm going to use the word truth, but I don't mean it in like a strict epistemological or analytical. That's what I should say. I don't mean it in a strict analytical sense. What I mean is, um, for the Romantics, our experience with nature reveals to us truths about ourselves as human persons, and also truths about our existence in the world, which is always a human existence, if that makes sense. So there's no way to step outside of our humanity, our humanness. So we have this kind of vacillating relationship with nature where it reveals to us these truths, and through our interaction with it, these truths are also revealed to us. Now, you, as a philosopher, you probably want to know what these truths are. That's probably a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, we can
Um,
circle back around, and I think we'll have
yeah.
time in the pandemic. Yeah.
Okay. So just a couple other things that make up sort of what we think about as romanticism. There's obviously an interest in poetry and poetic contemplation. So for the Romantics, poetry, the underlying idea here is language. Language is a universe to itself, as Isaiah Berlin, the great historian of Romanticism, said. So for the Romantics, language is not only descriptive, but it's also creative. So language doesn't just inform, it also enriches our experience of life. So for the Romantics, poetry and poetic contemplation was a way for us to see the symbolism. Let's say, put it this way: it was a way for us as human beings to draw upon the inventory of symbols that we have compiled through our existence and use them to imbue the world with a richness, a texture, a depth that any materialist, remember the Romantics are coming after the Enlightenment, any sort of rationalist or materialist view might conceal over. And then the last idea I think that's central to a Romantic way of thinking is the idea of the sublime or transcendence or the absolute. Those are slightly different ideas, but the Romantics were concerned with the idea that we can have certain types of encounters that both terrify us because they put our existence into question or call our existence into question. For example, standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon or watching a summer thunderstorm mount up in front of us, but also give us a sense of pleasure. This comes out of Edmund Burke's idea that in a way, the sublime uh, allows us to achieve a certain kind of perspective on our own um, smallness in life that in some ways gives us pleasure because it allows us to achieve a perspective. So
Mm.
those are five at least ideas. We could go on, but those are say five core ideas or a cluster of ideas that make up romanticism.
Yeah, and it seems to me I'm starting to already make connections to how this might be helping you think about the times we live in, the pandemic, but I would love to hear you draw out some of those connections. How are these ideas, these core ideas of romanticism, helping you process and think about the times we're living in?
Yeah, I have to say for myself, I've had an even more heightened attention and interest in romanticism since the pandemic kind of broke out. So one thing I want to not leave the listener with is the idea that there's a strict dichotomy or opposition between a scientific materialism and a romantic way of viewing the world. I don't think that those two things are mutually exclusive. I don't. I'm more interested personally in romanticism, but I don't privilege it as a form of knowing or a form of life over materialism. My interest in drawing out the connections and the possibilities of romanticism are to highlight and make available to people the strategies that romantics use to experience the world as a place of beauty and as a place of truth. And I'm using the word place intentionally here. So, scientific materialism presents the world as a space, right? Like I'm an object in this vast, ever unfolding cosmos, where the romantic view um, gives us an experience of the world as a place, somewhere where I am embedded and belong, even in some cases. Of course, for everything you say about romanticism, there's something some romantic that said the exact opposite, but you at least get the sense of what the romantics are up to. So during the pandemic, I think romanticism is relevant, especially in times like these, because the scientific truth of the pandemic speaks for itself. I mean, we have mounting death tolls. My wife practices anesthesia. She performs anesthesia on COVID patients. I'm very well aware of the scientific reality of infection. I understand to some degree the
Yeah, there's an intractability to that. There's a yeah.
exactly. There's just a raw fact of the materiality, so to speak, of the coronavirus, and
Although I will say this, I think it's clear that that does have to be spoken for, right? If our times reveal
absolutely,
anything, it's that raw
absolutely.
facticity must be spoken for.
There's no question about it. And that's exactly what I wanted to get at in that opening comment is
Ah,
that I
yeah.
don't want to create a distinction between or a false dichotomy between these two worlds, the scientific and
Mm,
the romantic with regard to the pandemic. What I want to suggest, so I'm 100% with you on that. What I want to suggest is that we have to carry and be responsible for the scientific fact of the pandemic, and we need to behave appropriately. There's no question about that, and there is a reality to it. At the same time, there is an existential impact in living in self isolation, and I think about my mother who lives down the street by herself. She's a widow, and I visit her every day, but I'm not there all day. And the time when I'm not there, she's alone and she's doing the right thing based on the science, but she has her own struggles existentially in her loneliness. And so what I want to say is that, or what I think anyway, is that the romantic way of thinking about the world allows my mother, for example, to look out the window and hear a songbird and make certain connections that have a symbolic resonance for her and can give her moments of beauty, even in the face of the grief that the pandemic has brought us in terms of the death toll and the existential loneliness that many people are feeling. So for me, that's where romanticism gains its heightened relevance right now.
mhm. Yeah, that's a powerful reframing. Um, I see a lot of people emphasizing things like being in the present and being mindful. Um, and right, these are all ways of not looking up at the big picture or not taking in a scope of time that is very hard to approach. But romanticism gives a very different approach to that. It's not about leaving the present. As you said, it's like hearing the songbird, but then allowing your mind to go to the infinite in kind of a different way,
Good.
or going to something much bigger in a different way than just being sort of overwhelmed by the amount of time this might go on.
That's exactly right. And I would a couple things about that. One is I don't think romanticism is 19th and I'm not suggesting that you're saying this, but just to call it out.
Hmm,
I'm not saying that romanticism is 19th century mindfulness because I don't think it's that.
right.
I think for the romantics, especially the creative responsive activity of the imagination is much more than being aware of my thoughts as they pass through my mind, or some sort of the Buddhist mindfulness movement thing. I don't think it's that. I think it's an active poetic engagement with the world. So that to just extend this story or anecdote of my mother, when my mother is outside and she sees a crocus poke up through the snow that we just got a day ago,
Yeah.
she actually can. Uh, in poeticizing it, experience a moment of beauty that, to use Wordsworth's language, in days or weeks to come during the quarantine, that image of the crocus can flash upon her inward eye, that is the bliss of solitude, and give her um, another dose of beauty, so to speak. And so it's not mindfulness in the sense that it's more active than that. And the other thing that I want to point out, the second point is, it's also not a form of escapism.
Mm.
It's not getting away from or closing your mind off to the reality of the pandemic that surrounds us, but it's living within it, but not to the neglect of the beauty that's co-present with it. So for me, that's the force or the invitation. That's probably a better word. That's the invitation of the romantic way or mode of thought, and what it has to offer us right now.
I feel like there's so much more for us to talk about and connections to make, including the potentially Buddhist origins of Romanticism in
Mm,
European thought.
yeah, good point.
So let's agree to come back around and talk more.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today, Andy.
Yeah, the pleasure was all mine. Thank you for having me.